Welcome back to EASD TV. Now, the session that we're going to look at is about cohorts, because cohorts have told us so much. And to introduce the session to us, I have Amalia Gastaldelli from, let me get this right, CNR in Pisa. Will you introduce, why did the EASD think that this was such an important subject and deserved a session of its own?
Well, there are several cohorts that has followed the natural history of type 2 diabetes, but this 4 cohort has the peculiarity to have really looked at the insulin resistance over the years using state-of-the-art techniques. So in this session, we really cover how the insulin resistance is measured, how is predicting type 2 diabetes, how is related also not only to insulin function, but action, but also to insulin secretion. So that is a very important session, in my opinion.
So now let me introduce the cohorts and their presenters. So I'm going to start with you, Andrea Natali from the University of Pisa. Tell me about your cohort. I mean, your baby.
Oh no, okay. Our cohort is a bit particular because it consists of completely normal individuals in terms of glucose tolerance, in terms of blood pressure, in terms of dyslipidemia. So essentially a cohort of healthy individuals who were evaluated at baseline and then followed in time to see why and understand through which mechanism they do develop diseases. The classic chronic metabolic diseases like dyslipidemia, like diabetes, and including also hypertension and atherosclerosis, which was one of the major outcomes of the study. So it's particular for the fact that it explores a very early phase in the natural course of the disease, because it's really how everything begins and how then leads to the disease that are blown and clearly up there.
And how many?
We started with 1,500 individuals from 20 centers in Europe who underwent a oral glucose tolerance test, beta cell function modeling, and a subset of approximately 1,000, they also had a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp done in order to measure insulin sensitivity using the gold standard method. A similar number of subjects underwent the full characterization in terms of carotid artery atherosclerosis by ultrasound measurements, and a series of questionnaire of hormones and so on and so forth, and genetics and metabolomics, proteomics.
Any old omics you can think of.
Anything you can think of. And then they were re-evaluated after 3.5 years. Clearly the cohort was reduced to approximately 900. And then they will be and are currently being re-evaluated after 10 years. And again, of course, the number shrink again to approximately 400.
Okay, now let me introduce our next cohort and the presenter of that cohort, which is Femke Rutters from the University of Amsterdam. Tell me about your cohort.
So actually there are 2 cohorts. One is, it started in 1989, which is the HORN cohort, which is a population-based cohort of about 5,500 people that are just from the general population, aged 40 plus, which we have been following in the past 35 years. And from that, because one of the main findings is that there was a large population of people with diabetes, but also a large population that had diabetes and didn't know. So, as well as a large population of those at risk. So one of the come-outs of that cohort is that the population of the patient cohort, the HORN diabetes care cohort, which is a care cohort of all the population with diabetes in the region, which is 15,000 people large.
Thank you. Now, if I can say this, is the granddaddy of all of all cohorts. Lars Lind from Uppsala University, tell me about your cohort, which is considerably older than you are, I think, almost.
Not really. I was actually 14 when it was started up in 1970, and at that time point, a little bit more than 2,000 men, all age 50, were investigated as a part of a PhD project. But that project sort of grew over time and progressed over time, and they've been re-evaluated every 10th year after that. And we actually, if it wouldn't be the COVID a couple of years back, we would have a 100-year exam of about 30 that was still alive.
Which is an extraordinary tribute, really. It's amazing that you followed them that long.
Yeah, there are some other, like Framingham Heart study that's even older, but nevertheless, it's one of the oldest around.
So, okay, let's hear from each of you what you consider to have been the main findings, particularly in regard to insulin secretion.
Well, at the age of 70, we did, and that was in the early 90s, we measured an oral glucose tolerance test with insulin measurements, as well as in Egger, this euglycemic hyperinsulinic clamp, measuring the peripheral insulin sensitivity. And one major finding from those determinations were that both were about equally as important to tell if somebody would gain diabetes in the next 10 years. So at that time point, I think it was our studies together that sort of coined that philosophy and those findings.
Femke.
I think that you have to see them respective to their age. So, for example, in the 90s, the prevalence of the diabetes was the big thing. Then in the 2000s, the pre-diabetic state, the metabolic syndrome, that was a risk factor for complications as well, was a big finding. In the 2000s, you get psychology being an important factor in people for diabetes. And in 2010, we saw a lot of data coming out of a cohort on prediction modeling. Can we predict in those with diabetes who get the complications and who not, which we can for microvascular, not for macrovascular. So I think it's like an ongoing trend thing that you see new things coming out of the cohorts.
And some cohort studies are not intervention studies. So was yours an intervention study?
No.
In that if you were found to be pre-diabetic, you were advised that you were pre-diabetic?
No, it's the population-based cohort is not an intervention study, and the patient cohort is of course a patient cohort, so they get treated as any other Dutch person with diabetes.
Okay. What were the main findings from yours?
This is a bit complicated because in the books it is written that type 2 diabetes appears when insulin resistance is not compensated by an enhanced beta cell function. We have come to the conclusion that this is not true and that diabetes do develop exactly because the beta cell is totally normal, but it is required to work more. If beta cells are required to work more, what are the way that these can be achieved? Well, some adaptation takes place into the beta cell so that it works slightly more for the same glucose stimuli. But the greatest part of the job is done by glucose itself, which by raising a little bit makes the beta cells work more as needed to overcome insulin resistance. So hyperglycemia is not the consequence of a failure in compensation, hyperglycemia, but it is the consequence of a successful compensation. for the beta cell to produce that insulin which is necessary to maintain glucose fluxes constant, either in the fasting state and in the fed state. So the poor beta cell does what it can. And whether that translates into severe hyperglycemia or a modest hyperglycemia, it depends on how good it is at the beginning of the whole story. If you have very good beta cells at the beginning, then this shift is not going to harm you much. But if your beta cells at the beginning of the story is not particularly robust, then this is going to have major consequences on hyperglycemia. So that is our point.
Amalia, just sum up for us, because we've had really quite, major findings that have come out of these cohort studies. What have they added to our knowledge?
Well, actually, my conclusion as a wrap-up to all these findings is that, of course, this confirms the importance of insulin action and secretion. Of course, as Andrea Natali said, this secretion is very important, but of course, it's the insulin action. And the studies has also showed that is a cluster of defects that add to this insulin resistance and insulin dysfunction. These are now still good because we started, and they are the base of a metabolic syndrome, the syndrome that was started a long time ago, and now is still active, is still used, but probably is not a syndrome, is not a disease, it's a cluster of defects, and all of these have to be addressed, and this is the importance of the study because they all highlight all these defects, and we need probably these new biomarkers to find out what are the defects. So my proposal is among these biomarkers, we probably should start measuring insulin as C-peptide routinely because, insulin is defective. We should know how much is our insulin, our C-peptide. So this is my conclusion for this symposium.
So I'm going to finally ask you very, very briefly, what's the future for your cohort and yours and yours?
Well, the future is probably in the past because we've been working for this for 50 years and there are some 1,000 publications from different angles from these cohorts. But we are still having some samples, blood samples in the freezer that we can pick out and run proteomics, metabolomics, and other omics technologies that might give us some clues on mechanistic things regarding diabetes and its complications.
Femke.
So we're currently focusing on the exposome, so everything around us, how does it influence all the biomarkers around us, how does that influence diabetes, as well as psychosocial factors. We know so much about the disease, but still the progression is increasing, so we need to halt that, and I think exposome and psychosocial factors are the way for new information to that puzzle.
We have to wait for 10 years follow-up data to finally rewrite entirely the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes in the textbook.
So thank you all very much for taking part in this, and can I just say a thank you, because all these cohorts depend on the generosity of ordinary people who are prepared to have nasty diabetologists come and do horrible things to them and have their blood taken and all the rest of it. And their data is so valuable. So a thank you to all of them on whom all these studies depend. We've got much more to come on EASD TV. Do join us again. Bye for now.